Welcome back to Face the Nation. Professor Rajiv Vijayasinghe, we start the second round with you. Just want to pose a question to you as well. You spoke about Nepal. During the last 16 years, there have been 13 presidents in Nepal. And this is quite overwhelming as far as the numbers are concerned. Now, many say that the constitution, whatever is there in place, is made based on the whim of the international community. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution, how do you position this on the eyes of the international community? Any international interference with regard to the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in Sri Lanka?
Well, I have no idea, because I think the internationals who might interfere would scarcely ask me, because they knew I am very independent. And I was told last year that the Americans were very, very keen to spend a lot of money to, as you put it, raise awareness, and I know they did it with a lot of people I knew. But I think when some of the people wanted to work with me about ideas for constitutional reform, I think the Americans panicked and said, no, you can't do that, because my independence is very well known. But I think several of the principles that I think we would like to take forward, we can learn a lot from the international community. One of our problems is we don't know. You know, when I brought up this question of secretaries, one very senior politician asked me, how do they do it in other countries? People don't understand. One of the tragedies of what I would call the post-78 parliaments is, it was bread and circuses. The whole electoral system was designed to produce cannon fodder or lobby fodder or whatever you call it. And I was horrified. When I joined Parliament, we were given certain books. One of them was by a former Secretary General, and it talks about how laws are made. And there is not a single mention in that book of the role of parliamentarians. She talks about how ministers hand over laws and the cabinet decides. And I don't think she understands, because they're all children of JR. And I think my advantage or my problem is, for me, and I think I'm the only one in Parliament, for me, Parliament is the Parliament of the 60s. When I first as a child went there, watched it, when my father was Secretary General, watched parliamentarians who were brilliant. Dudley Senanayake, Jaya Jayawardena, Felix Bandaranaike, Colbin R. De Silva, N.M. Pereira. There was cut and thrust of debate. There was discussion. And that was what I remembered. And then when I came back and went to Parliament in 1980, there was hooting. It really was a traumatic experience for me to see the way that the government treated Mrs. Bandaranaike when her civil rights were withdrawn. So those traditions of Parliament are vital. And you need to understand what goes on in the rest of the world. As I said, when we went to India, they told us about committees. But none of my colleagues bothered to even read the material. And I kept telling the Speaker, look at them, can't we try to do something about this?
So you're saying we need to transform this. We need to bring back that era once again.
Sonali, your time will be up in a minute, but we have to let Professor Rajiv Vijayasinghe speak.
I will get a few minutes more.
Approximately a minute.
I think absolutely necessary, but as I said, I lay a lot of hope on the electoral reform. You remember when Vasantha Senanayake and I first put forward ideas, we are the only people in government, and the opposition did nothing of the sort. We introduced private members' bills for reforms. And our two vital points we made in our writings were electoral reform and limiting the size of the cabinet. Because those are how you produce legislators, as opposed to people who think that there are people who just need to spend time and kowtow in order to get favor to get into the cabinet. You have to. And that is why it's vital. That's why I think Westminster may not work here, Salah. Because people are dying to get into the cabinet, and there's no sense of saying you get into the cabinet because you have executive capacity.
Dr. Saranamuthu, a constitution decides the future of the country, and you said that it should be complementary and coherent as far as the constitutional amendments are concerned. We saw the 17th Amendment to the Constitution being brought forward as an urgent bill in the year 2001 and relates to the establishment of the Constitutional Council. However, problems did arise following 2001. We have not really seen the establishment of such a commission until 2015. When implementing the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, will there be constraints and restrictions, and will it be a problematic situation to the serving president? 3 minutes starts now.
Well, let me also take the opportunity to respond to one point that Rajiv made in respect of civil society and the 19th Amendment. I just want to remind and put on record that a number of the proposals and suggestions of civil society were, in fact, communicated to those involved in the 19th Amendment, and some of them, in fact, dating back from the period of 2002, roughly 2002 to 2004, when there was this period of cohabitation, particularly with regard to the committee system in Parliament. And as far as the 19th Amendment is concerned, I mean, as I said, it could be a lot better. It could be a lot better. But I'm very glad, at least, that despite the relative silence that Dr. Vijay Singh is talking about with regard to the 19th Amendment in civil society, that it is a hell of a lot better than the 18th Amendment to the Constitution that we got in 2010, which civil society screamed and shouted and got hoarse about. And in fact, some of us were even threatened in respect of it. But with regard to the implementation of the 19th Amendment, look, at the end of the day, I firmly believe that the laws in themselves are insufficient. What you require is what I would call an animating political culture that makes them work as intended to. There are any number of countries, as we know, with wonderful constitutions at one level, but the actual practice is very different. So a lot is also going to depend on the extent to which this is not just about constitutional reform and legislative reform. It's also about a transformation in terms of popular political culture, and in particular, as far as the political parties are concerned. I mean, one of the key fundamental things, and we haven't really talked about it, and we really don't have a proper discussion in this country with regard to it, is the extent to which there should be intra-party democracy in this country. You know, you have these political parties that are run like fiefdoms, and you expect them to govern according to precepts of democratic governance. And it's just not possible at one level, you know. So my point with regard to the implementation, your question about the implementation of the 19th Amendment, there could well be problems. There could well be problems. It's not necessarily going to be plain sailing all the way.
Professor Rajiv Vijay Singh, a quick question to you. You supported the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. You raised your hand and supported it. 19th Amendment, you supported this constitutional amendment as well. What was going through your mind when the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was tabled in Parliament?
On the 18th Amendment, there are two parts to it. And the second part, frankly, I thought was better than the 17th, which was a hodgepodge and unprecedented in the world. Nowhere else in the world you have unelected people telling an elected president what to do. I thought the Parliamentary Council was a good idea, but unfortunately Ranil Wickremesinghe did not do his job. To give you a very simple example, when Mohan Peiris was proposed as Chief Justice, if I'd been on the council, I would have done a written statement explaining how bad he was. If Mahinda Rajapaksa went ahead, that was on record. Now, with regard to Shirani Bandaranaike, if you remember when she was appointed, the UNP raised Cane outside Parliament. Ranil Wickremesinghe said very proudly, I never went to meetings. But he accepted appointment. Sumantiran had the grace to say, I'm not accepting appointment if it's not veto power.
But you went ahead and supported the 18th Amendment.
No, exactly, because as I said, I thought the Parliamentary Council was a better thing. I didn't think Ranil would welch on his obligations. Now, so can I finish? If he had written out his objections to Shirani Bandaranaike, which were expressed in the press, they were very nasty about Shirani when she was appointed. Then when Mahinda Rajapaksa wanted to impeach her, they could have said, President, we told you all this and you appointed her. Why are you impeaching her for the things that we told you not to appoint her?
So as a public representative, you were waiting until the opposition leader at that time, who you are referring to, had to make, had to act.
I wasn't waiting. The constitutional provision at the time, and was sworn to uphold the Constitution, is that he should have given his comments on any person nominated by the President. He did not do so and allowed appalling people, Mohan Peiris being a case in point, to be appointed without formal opposition. With regard to the removal of term limits, I realize now that was a mistake, but I had written to the President in 2009 saying, don't have an early election because you will become a lame duck. You know, I knew what the syndrome was. My fear, and that is why I voted for the removal of term limits, but that was a mistake the way it turned out, was because given the possible potential successor, and given the tendency of Sri Lankan politicians to gravitate to a successor, which happened to Mahinda Rajapaksa and Chandrika Kumar Tugge in 2004, I thought Mahinda Rajapaksa is better than any of the then possible potential successors. I still believe this. Unfortunately, then gave power to those possible successors and allowed them to play hell with the country.
Second round of questioning.
I have a question for Dr. Saravanamuthu. You were talking about the implementation of the 19th Amendment. It's important now that authorities go ahead and implement it, which brings us to another amendment which has not been implemented since its passage in Parliament. You do some work with reconciliation. Is the 13th, in the current political climate, is the 13th Amendment a prerequisite to move forward on reconciliation?
Well, we have a peculiar situation in this country. We have constitutional amendments. In effect, they are part of the Constitution. You have politicians who will take oaths swearing to uphold the Constitution, and the Constitution is never implemented. I mean, the 13th Amendment being a case in point, it happened with regard to the 17th Amendment as well for a period of time. I think if the government of the day is firmly of the opinion that the 13th Amendment should be scrapped, or that those elements of it which have yet to be implemented should be revoked, we should go ahead and do so. We shouldn't have this limbo situation. As far as the 13th Amendment is concerned, I, for one, don't think it is adequate in terms of what it should be addressing. And therefore, I would like to revisit that whole question of a political settlement of the ethnic issue. And I look forward to that happening when the next Parliament is elected. But certainly, I mean, if we have amendments to the Constitution, we shouldn't go around engaging in what I consider to be quite a deceitful exercise, for example, for talking about 13th Amendment plus, giving the impression that there is a 13th Amendment in full that is being implemented, whereas the status quo is in effect 13th Amendment minus.
Professor Vijay Singh, on the 13th Amendment, when you already have major articles of the Constitution that are not being implemented, don't you think it's a priority to either, like Dr. Saravanamuthu said, either implement it or repeal it before you go ahead and enact new laws?
Well, I agree absolutely. I don't make comparisons, but I agree absolutely that we have really been totally irresponsible with regard to the 13th Amendment. However, I think, in all fairness to previous presidents who didn't do this, don't forget no president implemented it properly, the existence of the LTT was a real problem in terms of the 13th Amendment. I am afraid the pusillanimity of what I would call democratic Tamil politicians, understandably, because the brave ones were killed in the face of the LTT. But I think after the war ended, we had no excuse not to move. And I am on record in writing and verbally of telling the president, you've got to move on this. I think it's also...
To move on it as in implement it?
Implement it, or through discussion with the TNA, and don't forget he appointed me to that committee, and we only had progress when I was there. And I got significant agreement from the TNA to two suggestions I made. And, I'm not saying the president would have to implement 13 wholly, but I agree that if there are certain elements you think can't be done. And I found full agreement from the TNA on changing things. For instance, on land, it's very easy to implement the 13th Amendment together with the constitutional provisions on land, if you're sensitive to the fears of the other side. Everyone wants what they want. So I produced a draft. So I think we should have moved, and I've kept saying this, and I agree wholeheartedly with Sarah that I think one of the saddest parts about the government in the last 3 months is they've done nothing to further the cause of reconciliation. They finally appointed a committee after 2 months. That committee hardly functions. One of our former Liberal Party youngsters said that she was going to be asked to play a major role there. After 1 month, she still has been appointed. When the UN rapporteur on Truth and Reconciliation was here, he couldn't even meet this committee because the chairman wasn't here. So I don't think we're being very sensible on reconciliation, which I agree is vital. I think this is a perfect time to move because there's a lot of goodwill, but it's going to be frittered away at the rate we're going. And the way, for instance, the MPs in the Vanni, many of whom I think appreciated the work I did when I was advisor on reconciliation, they are feeling very upset because they are being neglected. This is turning into a Royal College government and absolutely no concern for the representatives of the poor areas amongst the Tamils. Something has to be done.
Dr. Saranamuthu, my question to you is also on reconciliation. Now, post-war Sri Lanka has seen several transitional justice initiatives. For example, the LLRC Commission, headed by Dr. C.R. De Silva, and then the Presidential Commission to investigate missing persons, headed by Mr. Maxwell Paranagama. Is this sufficient, or what do you advocate?
Well, I mean, no, I don't think it's sufficient. And at the present moment, what we have, Rajiv had referred to this, it was a presidential task force on reconciliation.
Presidential Office for Reconciliation, yes.
Which has now been turned into the Office of National Unity, I think it's called, going to be under the chairpersonship of former President Kumaratunga. And I do understand that they have been having a whole series of meetings. I, in fact, went with a delegation of civil society to talk to them. Now, when you talk about reconciliation, I mean, conventionally there are sort of four pillars to it: truth, justice, reparations, and the guarantee of non-recurrence. Now, it's not clear as to which of these, or whether it's going to be all of these, that this office is going to be looking at in particular. From our discussions, one got the impression that it was going to be largely reparations. Right. And there's already been land that has been returned to private owners, 1,000 acres, and hopefully that will continue. Now, with regard to truth and justice, as you know, the South Africans have come back on the scene and there have been conversations. We don't know whether there are actually going to be prosecutions or not with regard to accountability. But one thing I can say to you is that everyone in Tamil civil society that I have talked to has made the point very, very clearly that accountability is an absolute sine qua non when it comes to reconciliation. That, at the end of the day, there has to be an open, honest acknowledgement of what happened. Yeah? The government of Sri Lanka, in requesting a deferral of the UN Commission of Investigation report to September, should also realize, I think, that the bar, as it were, with regard to accountability has been raised. Expectations of what the government should be doing in this respect have been raised. The credible domestic mechanism will probably have to meet and must meet international standards. Talks about amnesty, etc., are not really on the table because at the end of the day, these are international crimes if people are found guilty of them, and you don't get amnestied for engaging in war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Are you saying the LLRC falls short?
The LLRC falls short for me in a number of respects, but I think the point with regard to the LLRC is that implementation of the LLRC, which fell short, also fell short. And that's why we got the resolutions in Geneva from 2012 right up to 2014 and the Commission of Investigation. So there are a number of things that have to be done on the front of reconciliation. There are relatively easier things to be done. For example, we really need to properly implement and prioritize implementation of the official language policy in this country.
Professor Vijay Singh, the current... sorry for speaking.
Sure. Professor Vijay Singh, this government came in on a sort of bandwagon of fighting corruption. So corruption achieved regime change. But actually there is no change because there is nothing to preclude crossovers happening. It appears that that is where one of the main corruption happens. How come that wasn't addressed?
No, I don't think that is where the main corruption happens. I think the corruption happened in a great extent with regard to contracts. And I think that is what we have to address. I think the whole idea of corruption with regard to Parliament has a very, very long history. You're probably well aware that in 1964 Mrs. Bandaranaike's government fell because Lake House bribed several parliamentarians, Esmond Wickramasinghe, to show the house he gave the man from Ratkama, Tilakaratna. You're probably well aware that in 2001 some people got money to cross over. I think ministries were promised. You know, in this case, Ranil Wickramasinghe had told Mr. Sumantiran, when he objected to Rishad Badruddin getting a ministry, no, we had to promise him a ministry, otherwise he wouldn't come over.
You wrote a letter to the chairman of the CIA, BOC, the Bribery and Corruption Commission, requesting an investigation. Any response?
No response at all so far, I'm sorry to say. Because personally, I think...
will you be
I
lodging
think we
a
should
formal
give Faraz an opportunity to pose the questions as well. You pose a lot of
What I want
questions. Faraz?
to ask is, okay, so you can't, you'll haven't addressed this crossover issue in Parliament.
Well,
but,
I mean,
but
when you have
couldn't there be some form of legislation to preclude the President from making ministerial appointments?
That is why I said you have a limit on the cabinet. In fact, Basant and I argued this.
But the limit isn't good enough, because
No, the limit is
dismiss
perfectly
one,
good
bring another
enough,
guy in.
because if you have only 25 ministers, you cannot bribe people with ministries, because then you get rid of some people who will then cross back over. That is why the limit is so essential. But now the present 19th Amendment, I'm afraid, entrenches that bribery, because it actually says very clearly, they use this term national government, then there a big argument about what is a national government. So I fully agree with you, Mr. Agarwal, there must be provision, but you have to have provision through making it very, very clear that they cannot have a ministry unless someone else loses out. My second point is, if you have an electoral system, you must also do what J.R. Jayawardena should have done when he tried to prevent crossovers, which says that if you resign, you lose your seat. But because he used the provision to expel people loosely, you remember Dr. Dahanayake was told when he wanted to object to the Kalawana business, you object, but next time there will be a vacancy in Galle. So that expulsion procedure also you need to treat very carefully. You're probably aware there was an attempt to expel me when I crossed over. So
Professor, you're very
that would have been unfair.
You're very critical about the standards of Parliament today, because you contrast this with the situation that was in the 60s. So going forward, how do you propose to transform this situation?
I think it's very simple. The minute you get rid of this ridiculous preference system, which is a vicious system.
So electoral reforms sufficient?
I think it will work. It won't work immediately. But, you know, now you have a situation where people come top of the district, either because they get well known because they have a lot of money, or because they are well known because they are on television screens or play games or whatever, or because they have been to jail. You know, a lot of people get in because of notoriety. In fact, J.R. Jayawardena introducing 3 preferences was completely mad and vicious. But I think if you have constituencies, every political party will choose as good a candidate as possible. You know, take this simple thing of the Rajapaksas. When Mahinda Rajapaksa stood for Beliatta, he was clearly the best of the Rajapaksa children for politics. But when you had this Manapa system, anyone who's connected immediately can ask for a ticket, and then they get elected.
Professor,
That's
you
how
need to
all
take
these children get in.
responsibility for the names that you're using right now. You have to take responsibility. You use the name of the President, the Prime Minister, so I assume that you will take responsibility.
I take full responsibility for
What you're
everything I've said. I've always taken full responsibility.
Dr.
Everything
Saramoto,
I've
where do you stand on the subject of electoral reforms? We'll probably see a system where 150 plus MPs will be elected on a first past the post. A lot of the minor parties are arguing against going for a first past the post system. Where do you stand? Do you think that it's time for Sri Lanka to do away with proportional representation?
Well, yes, I mean, with the possibility of this sounding like some sort of alumni association or something like that, the Liberal Party argued way back that we should have the German system, a combination of first past the post and proportional representation. And I would like to see as close to a 50-50 split as far as that's concerned, that you have your constituency MP and you have a vote in terms of the party that you would like to see forming a national government. I think the idea of the German system and this mix between the two has been distorted in terms of the debate that we've had in this country. And I think the two major parties seem to be more interested in finding a way through this system of still getting a 2/3 majority. And then we had the Dinesh Gunawardena committee, and you had this thing whereby it was suggested that the proportional representation dimension should be based on the votes of the best losers, which invariably may well turn out to be the big national parties, their votes when they come second in an electorate. So what I would like to see is a situation in which the number of seats in parliament held by a party will be based on the proportion of votes they win nationally. And you win what you get on the first past the post system in the constituencies, and you top up via PR.
Dr. Saramuthu, in 1970, Sirma Bandaranaike promised to introduce a constitution and received a two-thirds majority during the elections. And in 1972, a homegrown constitution was introduced in Sri Lanka. In 1978, J.R. Jayawardena introduced the present executive presidential system. How important is it to introduce a fresh constitution in Sri Lanka? 19 amendments since 1978.
Well, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the Constitution in 72 and the Constitution in 78 did not provide for democratic governance in this country. And in fact, under those constitutions, we've had an erosion of democratic governance. We've had civil wars in the country, one lasting for 30 years with horrendous damage. So what I would like to see is that we move towards a constitution that accommodates the aspirations and meets the grievances of all the peoples in this country, looks at bridging this democratic governance deficit, and is a constitution that will endure, that is not made for the challenges of that time alone, but that there is a far-sighted perspective with regard to making a constitution that will last. I think that's what's important. A party captures power, and they make that constitution in their own image, as it were. The 72 constitution is seen very much as the United Front constitution. The 78 constitution is seen as Jaya's constitution. We want a constitution of Sri Lanka.
What is the position of the Liberal Party, Professor Rajiv Jayasinghe?
Well, I'm so glad that the Liberal Party position hasn't changed for 25 years, and Sara and I are both saying the same things in terms of the principles. I think we have had differences in the past, in particular with regard to the response to the LTT, and I think it was important. I think we must be ever grateful that we are rid of the LTT. But I also think that getting rid of the LTT should have been on behalf of the Tamil people of this country, and not enough was done after the war. I think, as Sara said, we need to have a constitution that's based on consensus. I think that was planned in this, and that is why I'm deeply upset that the National Advisory Council should have been so confined. I think it's a tragedy that this Reconciliation Committee is not building on the past. For instance, you mentioned the LLRC. No notice is taken of that. I sent President Kumartunga the draft National Reconciliation Policy we had prepared, which covers a lot of the ground that Sara suggests. And, it should be amended perhaps as people want, but it's a very good initial draft, and I think you would agree.
A quick question.
But the whole point is that President Kumartunga is saying, yes, this is very interesting, we'll take into account when we draft the policy. Nothing has been done about it. As I said, I did a new act for the universities in 6 weeks. Why she can't, with all the intellectual in the world at her disposal? But she said, for instance, we are working, we have given up land, we've given up 200 acres. 200 acres in 2 months. I mean, what is happening? We have to understand these people have suffered for a long time. So I think the whole idea of haste, which was pledged in this, is completely ignored, and I'm very sorry about it.
Professor Jayasinghe, one quick question. What is your position in Parliament? Who are you supporting now? Are you an independent MP supporting the UPFA, or where do you stand?
I have always been a member of the UPFA. I continue a member of the UPFA. I am recognized as a member of the Liberal Party, so I'm not strictly subject, not that there's any formal whipping, but as you know, when I didn't vote for the impeachment of the Chief Justice, it was not considered anti, and I still continue. In fact, long before I resigned, the Liberal Party wrote into the UPFA saying we would like an alliance with you for future election, because we have always believed that, both parties went to extremes. Under J.R. Jayawardena there was like crony capitalism, under Mrs. Bandaranaike there was statist socialism. But in the long run, although both successors tried to move towards the middle, in the long run, the commitment to social equity, which should be the basis of a private sector-driven economy, not enriching the private sector, is, I think, better fulfilled by the UPFA rather than by the UNP. So I think we'd be happier with the UPFA, provided it is what I would call the old-style SLFP-led UPFA, not the racist elements that I'm afraid entered into it.
A constitution should address the grievances of the general public. We now go for a short commercial break, and then we come for the closing remarks.